From time to time, we talk about things that are basically a big setup for everyone involved to get offended or to act like they're offended. A minefield, basically, of sensitivities to...
Maybe we should just turn off the comment section.
And I think this is going to be one of those episodes. Interesting stuff, very interesting subject.
Comments macked fray.
But this is just something where people are going to get angry, or at least pretend to be angry. I don't know. We'll see. So if you live here in Krakow, if you've lived here for some time, you know that in the summertime months, especially in the latter part of the summer, large groups from Israel come here, high school kids, 14, 15, 16 years old, and large groups, and they go on guided tours of Kazimierz and Podgorza, and they go to Auschwitz, of course, and then back to the airport and back to Israel. And this is part of their curriculum. This is something that all kids do in a certain grade or at a certain age in Israel, is make this trip to Poland, visit concentration camps. It's part of their, I guess, what you might call Jewish identity education, given the extensive Jewish history here in Poland, not just in the context of the Holocaust, but going back for many, many years before that, of course. These trips were suspended in 2020 because of the COVID pandemic. And now, this year, the governments, the Polish and the Israeli governments, were trying to get the details sorted so these trips could resume. However, representatives on the Polish side have taken advantage of this opportunity, of this pause, you might say, to kind of renegotiate some terms. They want to change some things about these tours and how they're conducted, how they're organized. Two major things, I think it's a longer list, but the two major things are they want to put an end to the fact that the Israeli groups have up until now been allowed to bring armed guards, or at least hire armed security here, local security here in Krakow and elsewhere. So no more guns. And the other thing they want to change is kind of the, I guess what you might call the atmosphere. I don't know how they're going to do this. We'll talk about the details in just a moment. But the Polish representatives are complaining that too often these tours are used to promote the wrong idea about Poland and Poles, the wrong idea about how Poles behaved during the Holocaust, the wrong idea about Polish mentality and attitude towards Jews in Israel. And they want to kind of reset this and kind of promote, let's say, a friendlier, more positive pro-Polish position, in the sense that it presents Poland as friendly towards Jews and it's already difficult. It
is difficult. It's not a matter of being saying that they're friendly towards Jews, but not showing Poland as being somehow
not unfriendly,
overtly adversarial,
yes,
or something
exactly.
like that.
I mean, the problematic thing, let's just get right to it now, is that I think it's beyond argument that there was a percentage of Polish nationals during the Second World War who were not actively helping or protecting Jews.
And not particularly sad that what was happening to the Jews was happening.
And this is where it becomes very difficult and obviously very kind of politically highly charged, because I think there are some factions who would like to very much play up the fact that, no, the Poles were not really the good guys, that actually there was quite a lot of bad guys hidden amongst them. And especially with the current government we've had, they've taken quite substantial measures to try and march this back a little bit, and like legal measures. And there's been arguments with other countries in the past about this. They certainly didn't like the idea of the death camps being referred to as Polish death camps. They insisted on them being referred to as Nazi death camps, which I think is a pretty reasonable point. I also think that if you are the government of a country that is an independent sovereign state, that you kind of have an obligation to present your country in the best light possible to the rest of the world as a duty to your citizens.
Let me sneak one more thing in that I should have mentioned a moment ago before we dived into this. Anyway, as a result of this Polish request to renegotiate the terms of these visits, the Israeli side has called them off. They've canceled them. So there will be no visits this year. Maybe they'll take the coming year to kind of, work out their problems, and maybe it will resume in 2023. But again, they were supposed to resume this year after a COVID-caused COVID caused an interruption, but again, now that they want to change some things, the Israelis are saying no. We're going to skip it for this year, and we'll see how it goes next year. Let's take one thing at a time here. Let's back up to the gun issue and kind of talk about this and get it off the table. Do we have a problem with the Poles objecting to the fact that the Israeli groups have armed security when they're here?
I mean, from what I understand, there were special carve-outs in the laws made specifically for these two groups to allow them, the guards there, allow them to have guards, and for those guards to be armed and to be legally permitted to use those weapons in certain scenarios. What I always thought was kind of odd about this is that there are so many two groups here, Jewish, Israeli, other as well, that they wouldn't stick out except for the fact that you can see that they're walking around with armed guards. And, a lot of people complain saying, well, this might give the impression to these visiting here that Poland is somehow more dangerous than any other place. I've never heard of, the occasional drunk person attacking another drunk person here. That might happen, but locals or other tourists attacking tourists here based on their ethnic or cultural background, I've never heard of that happening here. I've never heard of a scenario where they needed to have armed guards here.
So you think it's a reasonable request for the Israelis to drop the guns?
To at least talk about that, yes. I mean, if I'm generally a pro-gun person anyway to begin with, I don't like the laws in Poland that limit access to weapons and the right to self-defense. But I can't see why they as one group should have more access to self-protection than another group.
Do you not agree with the fact that, that's a loaded question. Do you think that perhaps the Israelis are a unique, higher threat level kind of target simply because of who they are and the world that we live in, and that justifies having the armed guards?
In a very general way of speaking, in the world at large, maybe, but here in Krakow, if you're walking around and you're Jewish, you're black, you're Islam, you're French, you're Italian, you have the same chance of being attacked by a drunk student as anybody else.
Josh?
Well, I think the first thing that immediately came to mind when we started talking about this whole issue of them feeling the need to have armed guards or armed security for these groups is, so what historical evidence have we seen of incidents that justify the necessity for having them? I mean, have there been cases of groups of Israeli school children being set upon, targeted, attacked in some way, and it's only been the presence of armed security that has thwarted these attacks? Do we have any
Well, there have been attacks on Jewish diplomatic institutions, on Jewish, the El Al airline stands and airports, Jews themselves, Jewish tour groups. I mean, do they have to have? Do we have to have examples of attacks on Jews for them to justify the potential threat going forward? I mean, how many examples do you need in order to?
Well,
justify?
I think just because, I mean, you're citing them as an example for the various kind of situation in the world in general.
Munich in 1972. That's the spark behind all of this.
Well, right. Okay.
Is that not enough?
I mean, my question is, because honestly, I'm naive about this. When they have groups going to other places in the world, maybe visiting Germany, the German death camps there, or do you have armed security as well? I mean, I hear about more attacks of Jewish people in France and in Germany. I've never heard of anything here in Poland, at least recently at all.
But if we're getting into hypotheticals, Dr. Mike, if God forbid there was some kind of attack, a deadly attack on these groups, and they did not have armed security, wouldn't that be the first question? Why didn't you have armed security to protect them?
I mean, this comes back to the fact that, this goes against my other views that I believe most people should have the right to be armed at any time if they choose to. So this is where I have mixed feelings. For me, it's like if they found a way to be armed, it's more power to them. But the fact that they're the only group here that seems to have that kind of general right to this or easier access makes me feel it seems odd. Plus, then I feel like the threat here is more that they're expecting a threat from some other foreign group coming here and attacking them while they're here.
But not from Poles.
They're not necessarily thinking that it's unsafe here. It's just that if they're not armed all the time everywhere, then other dangerous forces.
I think that's a reasonable point.
And that's what I think is the more likely cause. Not that they actually feel that they're specifically more threatened here. It's just wherever they go, they're threatened. So
because to be honest, I mean, if I could think of one group that is most liable or most likely to be attacked attacked by like local thugs who enjoy kind of, hitting people over the heads with foreigners over the heads with baseball bats. It would be the British stag groups.
So, wait, Josh, I'm unclear on your position here. So, do you have a problem with the Poles asking the Israelis to leave the guns at home, or do you think the Israelis should be able to bring the guns if they want or if they feel it's necessary?
I think the Polish point of view is reasonable in that why should you have special treatment when nobody else gets to have special treatment? Okay. However,
if I'm the Israelis, my answer to that is, well, these are your people. You can give them the right to have a gun tomorrow.
Well, I kind of agree with that. I mean, I think,
So don't blame me.
Well,
I'm the Israelis. Don't blame me. These are your laws in your country for your people. You allow us to have guns. We appreciate that. We're thankful for that. We think it's necessary. But if you think it's unfair to Polish people, I'm not responsible for Poles. You are.
I mean, for me, there's another issue here of perspective. When they bring these young people here to Poland, are they giving these, students, these teenagers, the impression that Poland is unsafe? Or
that's getting into the next topic. Okay, let's go ahead and cross over into that. Let's leave the guns behind. Although the guns are part of it. Yes, as you mentioned earlier, Dr. Mike, the kids see that their escorts have guns, and that makes them think, not unreasonably, that they must be in a dangerous place, right? Not only is Poland a dangerous place generally, maybe specifically it's extra dangerous for them because of who they are and where they are from. And that kind of sets the tone for their whole visit, which kind of might present Poland in a very bad light. And the Poles want to do something about this as well. Josh?
Well, look, to be clear on this, though, wouldn't it be the case that if they are Israeli kids from Israel who go to school in Israel and live in Israel, that they're not altogether unfamiliar with the sight of armed people whose job it is to protect them? Because if you live in Israel, there is a hopefully low level, but a constant threat.
Yeah, makes sense.
I mean, this also
not the first time they've seen a gun.
No.
This also makes me wonder about these trips as well when they come here to Poland. I had a friend from another country, but also of like Jewish background, Israeli background. He came to Poland on this organized trip, and he was here in Krakow, and he was basically just a few days in Poland, no interaction with anybody or anything outside of what the tour group had to show them. So, here's the Jewish Museum, here's the Holocaust, here are the Holocaust sites, here's Auschwitz, here's the ghetto. And that's it. I remember
back to the airport, back to Israel.
And I was like, I haven't seen you in years. Let's meet up. And it was like 72 hours. It was gone.
Well, okay. Yeah, on the one hand, I agree that's a problem. And the whole time they're under armed escort. They spend all of their time in a hotel or in transport to one of the places that you mentioned, back to the airport, back to Israel. But at the same time, though, from a security perspective, if the visit is sensitive enough and dangerous enough to justify armed security, then you can't have free time where 200 kids go out on their own in 200 different directions for the next 6 hours.
That's how it works with so many other exchange groups here coming from different countries. Because I finished high school here, and we had one group that came from England, exchange group from Devon, Turkey, Devon, whatever. You know those regions. Torquay, is that it?
Torquay in Devon. Turkey and Devon, marvellous. I'm going to have to share that.
Just randomly forgot about that. And we hung out here.
It's where Fawlty Towers is.
Okay, so we hung out here. We went to bars. It was fun.
Of course you did.
And then a few months later, it was the group from Israel that came. They were friendly and fine as well. But, here we went to Auschwitz. There was less like social interacting. We didn't go to Israel, which I thought was like, what's the point of a student exchange? I thought we would go to Israel. I remember being seriously bummed out about that. Though as a kid, I don't remember there being any issues. I don't remember any armed guards. I just might not have noticed that. I remember when I talked to these kids, it was more that, since I'd lived in the U.S. before coming to Poland, culturally, I felt I identified with them more than I do with the Polish kids here after only being here for a year or so. Just like TV shows and pop culture and stuff like that, Israel seemed a little more connected with the same things that I had grown up with than, say, kids here in Poland. And I don't remember any awkward conversations about, did your grandfather work at the concentration camp or anything like that? Or did your friends, like grandparents, steal my grandparents, mill or something like that? There was nothing like, no bad blood, no issues, just a bunch of kids away from home hanging out with each other.
So the other thing that the Polish government wants to change, in addition to the gun thing that we talked about, is they and I don't know how you do this, how you kind of, how you implement a plan to make what are the metrics for changing this? I don't know. They want the Israeli kids to have a different perspective. They come away very often with a very negative perspective, and maybe they're primed for that. Maybe their whole lives they've heard that Poland is this terrible place where their families and maybe the Jewish people were subjected to these awful horrors that we all know, we're all familiar with. That's why Auschwitz is here. Majdanek, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. That's what, there's no coincidence. It's all in Poland. Maybe they had family that had property lost here, just horrible, horrible things. So their entire lives, they've associated Poland with negativity in some form, which is perfectly understandable. I think everybody would. But then they come here with armed guards, which kind of reinforces this negative impression. As we mentioned a moment ago, they spend zero time outside of the careful watch of these armed people. The whole time they're on a tour bus or in a hotel with their friends. Back to Israel, zero contact with the local people. And the Polish government wants to change this. How can they? What are they going to make them spend quality time with their Polish peer group? Visit a Polish high school. I don't know. Anything I can think of involves more time. Then you get into budget considerations, both time and money budget considerations.
And it's like we want to counter your propaganda with our own propaganda. And
yes.
It's like, well, what makes your propaganda better than our propaganda?
So I just don't see the middle ground here where both sides can come away happy.
And there is the whole issue of you have a bunch of teenage children in a foreign country. I mean, it's like herding cats at the best of times. So very often the best way to deal with it is to have a very, very strictly defined schedule and, not give them a spare moment.
I mean, I can say when I was here in high school in Poland, the issue of ethnic differences in Jewish and stuff like that, it never, when I was in the States, it popped up once in a while in conversations, stuff that I was just not expecting, anti-Semitism. Here in Poland, I just did not encounter that in high school here. So, later on when I started hearing about that Poland had a reputation for being anti-Semitic or anything like that, I just didn't quite understand that. I mean, maybe I was raised, in a family in a group of people that just wasn't a topic, but another thing is that you brought up. It's they come to Poland, they have these negative ideas or thoughts of Poland, and all the concentration camps were here. Well, one of the main reasons the concentration camps were here was because the bulk of the European Jewish population was in Poland. We're talking ballpark.
Well, outside of the Soviet Union, of course, but
we're talking ballpark 50%, and you have to ask yourself, well, why were they here if it was so bad? One of the main reasons was it was a lot better than
friendly
anywhere
country
else.
In many ways.
There was anti-Semitism here, but that's if half the population, Jewish population of Europe, was in Poland, and say half of the anti-Semitic interactions were in Poland. Well, just statistically speaking, that's perfectly understandable. And this is during World War II. They talk about this is another thing that a lot of people might not understand outside of Poland. Helping the Germans or killing to find Jews or kill the Jews was looked upon as any type of collaboration with the Germans. It was looked upon by the rest of society with disgust. Just the way as during wartime when you hate collaborators, those people that helped the Germans when it came to capturing Jews or sold out Jews in their neighborhood or something like that were despised to an extent that most people just can't understand it. They were collaborators. They were the worst of the worst. So, if you help the Germans by signing up with them and fighting with them, or help the Germans by, giving information about the resistance, or help the Germans by selling out the Jews that were hiding in the barn around the corner, or even worse, killing Jews, then you were looked upon as the scum and the filth of the earth that you were because you were a collaborator. And so when Poles hear, especially older ones, about, how Poles helped kill Jews, that's like calling Poland a nation of collaborators. It's something that really stings. Yes, there were collaborators in Poland, just like in anywhere else that was occupied by the Germans. But when you just look at the sheer numbers of how many Jews were here compared to other countries and how many people here collaborated with the Germans, they were just so much lower than anywhere other country.
Well, I think actually, this just briefly goes off the specifically Jewish issue at the moment, but I think there's also quite a widely held belief that Poland was one of the first countries to surrender at the beginning of the Second World War, due to it being one of the first countries to be invaded and occupied. But in fact, and Poles are very proud of this, they never surrendered.
Unlike some countries we could mention, France. And Poland, the only country, correct me if I'm wrong here, the only country not to supply an SS division of local volunteers as well.
Norway, Sweden,
Belgium, France, Italy, they lined up to join the SS and join the Wehrmacht.
Poland also one of the few countries to have on the books the death penalty for helping anybody hide or harbor Jews. If you're saying that Poland helped the Germans, round up Jews, but this was the only country they had
wouldn't
to
need to threaten people.
There were stories here, and we're not talking anecdotes, but historical records of entire villages being mowed down by the Germans because they were just hiding one Jewish family. Yeah. So then, of course, there were negative stories about helping the Germans find Jews, but there were so many ones of heroism and sacrifice. And when Poles hear this, it just irks them in a very specific way. It's very brutal. And, the current government wants to kind of remind people that, this is wartime. It was nuanced. Let's remember what actually happened, what it looked like. And the funny thing is, the Israelis and the Poles could completely understand each other because they can both hate the people that were collaborators. There is nothing wrong with saying that if you were Polish and you were a collaborator, you should be written off. You should be despised. You should be counted off as a human being completely. So let's look at our common enemies and not just look at one side or the other.
I don't know much about how the Israelis organize this. I kind of trust them to do it the right way. They know what they're doing. But there is part of me that thinks that 14, 15 years old is probably too young to understand a lot of these things, even if they do have this family connections in many cases, as they do quite often. I mean, when you're 14 or 15, do you really understand what you're looking at, the context, the messy details, the kind of, middle ground between different versions that you hear? I don't know, but
I'm not sure that you would even be fully capable of being aware of the horrors of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Actually, you could have the information, you could repeat it parrot fashion, but the depth of imagination, having the ability to comprehend the scale and the horror of it, I suspect is beyond.
I appreciate the fact that they want to make this part of everyone's experience as they grow up, and obviously they only have so many years to do that. Once they finish high school, you're not kind of, in the hands of the government, so to speak. And even in your last year of school, I don't know how old you're in Israel, I guess 18, maybe 19, I don't know. There must be some reason why they don't do it later. But I just think at that age, I'm just kind of skeptical about what they get out of it sometimes. And but what would you say, Dr. Mike? What would you say to somebody? And again, this is the case of many Israelis. They do have, in their very recent family history, relatives who were lost in the Holocaust here in Poland, in Polish concentration camps. That is to say, concentration camps located in Poland. Maybe family property confiscated by the post-war communist government here. In many ways, they do have a legitimate beef, so to speak, with Poland and Poles. I don't think any visit is going to erase that. And we're not talking logic here. We're not talking about a logical explanation about why it's not the fault of people in Poland today. We're talking about visceral, something you feel in your bones. It's just, this was your family 2 generations ago, maybe 3. And there's no amount of calm, rational, logical explanation that's going to change your mind. What about those people?
Exactly. Actually, that's why I think you need to find more chances here to interact with locals and people that live here, and understand that you have people living here in Poland that also lost family members during World War II that were brutally taken away from them. They have grandmothers and grandfathers that fought in the resistance. Then when the communists came, if your grandparents were in the resistance, they were either shot, arrested, set off to Siberia, or had to hide in the woods for 5 or 10 years. You have to understand that there are shared struggles and shared tragedies. So instead of seeing each other as opposing forces, understanding that this was a tragedy that affected everybody, and it should be something more to unify people. We know your pain because we went through this pain as well. And
well, actually, I think it's maybe worthwhile adding that very significant numbers of German high school children are sent on trips to Auschwitz each year. And, of course, that's not quite the same perspective. Because in a sense, I mean, they're being, if there is such a thing as collective national guilt, which I think is a terrible, terrible notion. But I mean, they're certainly being reminded.
Well, if you want to have, if once you have the concept of a nation state and you have the concept of national pride, then you also have to have the concept of national shame. You can't just look at all the good sides of your history and traditions without acknowledging there were bad things there as well. I mean, and that's actually something that I think that's a problem when Germany, they seem to kind of detach from what happened during World War II, that it wasn't the Germans, it was the Nazis. Oh, it was because only X amount of percentage of people were actually in the Nazi party. Or it's like, my grandfather, he wouldn't really have wanted to join the army. It's like, no, there was a lot of nationalist fervor back then. And I don't want to use the term collective guilt, but there is a concept, I think, of like general like national shame or acknowledgement that, my forefathers, my ancestors were responsible for this. And this, I'll say this about Poland as well, or any other country, that if you want to take pride in good things, you have to also acknowledge a responsibility, maybe not responsibility, but acknowledge the negative things that happen as well. But this is what history is all about.
Well, I think it's fair to point out, nevertheless, that probably of all nations in the world, Germany has done more and tried hardest to, face up to and acknowledge, the crimes of.
They have, but this is what I was saying. Lately, it's no longer the Germans; it's always the Nazis. And I think that's like a subtle shift towards kind of.
But I think that's okay. I think that's reasonable. I mean, I think that we could arguably make the case for other extreme political ideologies and the various kind of dire consequences. Russia, which affect the world. But I mean, I still don't think that detracts from the fact that. Historically, in the immediate post-war period, like Germany took, Japan, for example, Japan has exhibited no contrition, no shame, no embarrassment, no sense of.
They still have these shrines where you can worship the heroes of the.
I mean, occasionally, there's a new prime minister or whatever, and he goes.
I would argue that Germany's. Deep and abiding support for the European Union is a form of self-flagellation.
Yeah.
Subverting, is that the right word? Subverting their own power to a multinational organization that they're in charge of. Basically, yes.
Well, yeah.
We're getting a little bit off track here, but anyway. I'm curious to see how long it's going to take to resolve this. I can't see this not getting resolved. This year, okay, we have to write it off. It's already the end of June.
I think we need to throw in one more thing here. Didn't we just recently have elections in Israel as well? This could also be, change of education minister, change of policies in the last year or so, last few months, that we don't know. I don't know what the internal political situation right now is in Israel when it comes to
I think it's a pretty lame government as well. It's kind of shored up, it's a coalition shored up.
But in the big picture, I imagine this is just almost insignificant, this matter of, the school trips to Poland. I'm wondering if the gun issue is a no compromise, is a red line, a line in the sand for certain things with Israeli groups. If they come here as officially as an Israeli group, they're not coming here as private citizens making their own way. They're coming here as a government field trip in a sense. Then we have armed security. End of story. There's no compromise on that.
Now, I mean, arguably this might have been better located in our news for this week, but I did read something this week which I forgot about when we were preparing the news, which is quite interesting, which is that the government is announcing that it wants to very much increase the idea of civil defence in this country, kind of like have more reservists, have more weapons training. There's a plan to build firing ranges in, a large number of, not just large, but, medium-sized cities. And that they are going to be looking at readdressing the whole legislation surrounding gun ownership, which at the moment is extremely restrictive. And I don't think there's any sense that we're going to have a situation which would no doubt have the Liberals throwing their hands up in horror of teenagers wandering into your local gun store and walking out.
I can see it being relaxed a little bit, but I don't see American-style attitudes.
No, but I mean, I think that the thing is that if you have and I'm not going to take a position on whether America is right or wrong on this, because of course it varies from state to state anyway. But I think that in principle, I think that citizens should have the right to bear arms, but I think that, like with any responsibility, with any right, there comes responsibilities. And if you're starting with a bottom-up system whereby you're putting in firing ranges and there are regulations, and it's there from the beginning, like you can have a gun if you've got the certification and you're trained and blah blah.
Well, we
blah,
talked
blah.
about this a few weeks ago when we did an episode on would Poles fight in the same way that the Ukrainians are fighting now if there was some theoretical invasion.
Well, this is obviously what's prompted this.
And I think, the whole situation with Russia is definitely got more people talking about it.
Yeah.
And it raises the question that I think I raised when we were talking about it some time ago. If we're supposed to fight back, okay, great. We'll fight back with what? Frying pans? And rocks? No. We have to fight back with guns.
Yeah.
And that means, creating a gun culture in the sense that, getting people familiar in the context of a gun range or basic information, basic knowledge about how they work and handling them and being responsible owners and whatnot. That's a conversation that's going to take a long, it's not going to.
Okay, but it's like there's been an official government
statement. It has taken a step forward.
It's on the table.
For sure.
For
sure. But again, going back to the Israeli thing, I just wonder if it's just simply something that, if you can't agree to this, well, then I'm sorry, we can't work together.
I wonder if there's ever been talk about a compromise. Okay, like you can't have your own security guards, but we'll give you, say, 4 police officers or
exactly. Why can't they? I always wonder why they just don't use and pay for somehow the Polish police. Why not that?
Well, I think there's also, with some justification. Israel takes great pride in the training and efficiency of its various levels of security services.
They're not good enough.
And they may well think you made that point about Munich 72 earlier is a very, very good one. That was a line in the sand, really. We're never ever going to let this happen again.
Right. I think that's behind all of this. Yeah, for sure. Has to be. Well, very complicated topic. We hope we made you think about some aspects of a complex issue anyway, and we're curious to see how it plays out. Don't forget to go to our website, KrakCast.pl. More than 400 back episodes still there, still waiting if you haven't made your way through all of them. Go back to one we made last week about the Hungarian language. I'm still recommending that because I listened to it last night and I think it's quite good. So check it out if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time after. Oh, by the way, we're taking next week off. So we'll see you, the first week in July. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the KrakCast.